listeners, and welcome to episode 2 of season 6 of Solarpunk Presents. In this episode, I, Ariel, talk to Selena Middleton of Stelliform Press all about publishing eco-fiction, which includes both solarpunk stories and eco-horror. Selena makes some fascinating points about solarpunk's relationship to eco-horror and vice versa, and I'm excited for you to hear them. Before we get started, I just wanted to say that we're so grateful for you, our amazing listeners, and all of the support that you've shown us over the past while. Whether it's through reviews on iTunes or your other podcatchers, or financial support on Patreon or PayPal, or even just dropping a comment on our YouTube or Mastodon, it's really lovely to feel seen and part of a larger conversation about solarpunk. At the end of the day, we're a little independent podcast producing ad-free content, and we'd like to keep it that way as long as possible, and we believe we can with your support. Okay, on to the episode. Hello, listeners, and welcome back to another episode of Solarpunk Presents Podcast. I'm your host, Ariel, and this week features my chat with Selena Middleton, the publisher and editor of Stelliform Press, which recently published, among others, previous guest Michael DeLuca's The Jaguar Mask, Sarita Ulibarri's Another Life, Sim Curran's Seed for the Swarm, Tiffany Morris's Green Fuse Burning, and many, many more. Welcome, Selena, and thanks for being here with me today.
Thanks for inviting me. I'm so excited about this conversation.
Could you start out by telling the listeners a little bit about yourself?
Sure. So my name is Selena Middleton. I am publisher and editor at Stelliform Press. I started the press, a kind of brainchild from some work that I did during my PhD. As far as its origin goes, I saw a gap in what kind of literature was being called environmental or eco-fiction or climate fiction when I was doing my literature review for my own PhD dissertation. And being a writer myself and having seen a little bit of the processes sort of on the back end of publishing, I thought I could probably publish some things, and thought I would get started slowly with some novellas. And now we're generally publishing anywhere between like 3 to 5 books a year, and all of them focused on climate fiction in different ways, and ranging from science fiction and fantasy, horror, and literary crossovers as well. Eventually, I hope that Stelliform will be publishing nonfiction as well, but we're not quite there yet. All of our catalog is fiction at this time. Is that it?
Well, I was going to ask you what led you to decide to start Stelliform Press. You did kind of cover that, but if you want to elaborate on that.
Oh, sure. Yeah, I've talked about this a little bit before, but of course, different people might be listening to this. So what I started a PhD project focused on climate fiction. And at first I was reading the works that were being labeled climate fiction, which were works by a lot of white men. And I wasn't too impressed with the cultural content of those books, whether that be how those authors addressed women in their fictional worlds, women's involvement in whatever kind of ecological fixes they were discussing as part of the storyline. Of course, marginalized people sometimes didn't have a great showing in those books, either were not included at all or included in sort of peripheral ways around the white protagonist. And after I, quite frankly, just got sick of reading that kind of stuff, I moved on. I was taking other courses at the time during my coursework year and took some courses on Indigenous literature and really liked that approach to environmental storytelling. And so I read a lot more. There was a couple authors that made it into my dissertation. Mary Curisato does a lot of really interesting far future Indigenous perspectives, and also Canadian Lee Miracle. She has done some interesting things with stories set in space, which is kind of unusual for well, maybe not so much anymore, but, back in, say, the 2010s, it was a little bit more unusual to see that setting in particular.
Right.
So, yeah. Sorry. Go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to ask you, in your dissertation, sort of like, do you have a set time period that you were looking at? Sort of like, what was the parameters of it? And you said different nationalities. Were you looking at mostly North American fiction or sort of climate fiction from where in the world?
I did have to constrain it, and I ended up constraining it to anything after the 1960s written by women that was focused on exoplanetary environmental storytelling. Ooh. So all of the stories that I discuss in my dissertation are not set on Earth. And so there's a lot of nostalgia for the effects of, what it was like to live on this planet, turning back to the planet and looking at it from that perspective. A little bit depressing at times, especially since a lot of the stories were looking back on a completely ruined Earth. And the stories were often about what did we take away from that experience? What do we take with us to a new planet? And how does that affect how we build a new community?
Interesting.
So, yeah, it's definitely a different, I haven't seen other people focusing on that particular aspect of climate fiction. And I'm sure some people wouldn't call it climate fiction, but I did broaden the definitions a little bit for my project. Now, the project was focused on feminist science fiction, but many Indigenous writers don't necessarily call themselves feminist and would approach those topics from an Indigenous lens, the lens of their traditional teachings and their specific communities. So I used the word feminist a little bit in the dissertation for authors who specifically labeled themselves feminists, but not for all of the authors that were included.
Okay, interesting. And yeah, I think that counts as climate fiction because it's talking about a climate, whether it is the climate of Earth or the climate of this new place, or reflecting on, the climate that led to ruination, the social climate or political climate or environmental concerns, that sort of thing.
Yeah. If I can add just a little bit more.
Yeah, sure.
What made me ultimately abandon the works that were considered climate fiction by most people, the white men canon of climate fiction, was that there were, well, as I mentioned, there were a lot of gaps in terms of who was involved in futures, and the silences were quite loud. There were some works that were really trying hard to include marginalized people, but always from the perspective of a white protagonist. And
tokenism, I would imagine.
Yeah. And it just, I guess it got boring. So it got boring. And I found works by Indigenous authors especially, and Black authors as well. I found those works much more exciting for how they viewed the future. I found it more... Now, when I say inclusive, I don't necessarily mean in terms of race or gender, but like a holistic kind of inclusion. Like,
really?
It's not necessarily about individuals who's included, but how they're included. It's been a while since I had anything to do with my dissertation. Oh, can you hear the wren?
Oh,
I'm
no,
outside and there's angry wrens all around me. One of the things that I expanded for my dissertation was the idea of ecology. And, many people, scientists, might define ecology as, a network of relationships within an environment. And I expanded that to include human emotion and communities, and considered those connections and relationships as part of an ecology, either that community or that individual as part of a community was involved in directly, as in that's where they lived, or an emotional connection to an environment that they've lost. So I found that those kinds of considerations were much more common in environmental fiction written by marginalized people, and specifically Indigenous and Black writers. Now, I mentioned Mary Curaçao and Lee Miracle. Sherry Dimline is another one that does that kind of thing. And Nell Hopkinson, Octavia Butler. And you do get a sense of the expansiveness of the individual within the community, even when the characters are isolated. And to me, that was a really important part of considerations for a healthy and sustainable environment. We can't have healthy and sustainable environments when we don't have considerations for people's communities, their fulfillment within those communities, and that kind of thing.
Right. Yeah. And I'm just thinking about the latest talk that Christina and I had about community and the sort of us versus them and individualism. We talked a little bit about that in the closing episode of season 5, and sort of about how in Solarpunk, we talk a big game about community, but what does that actually mean? And it can't just be a community fulfillment. There has to be an individual fulfillment. So there has to be sort of this interesting kind of yin-yang kind of, I guess, interplay between the individual and the community in order for things to work out, for people not to get, I guess, lost within a community. Would you say that that's sort of what you were observing, or does that ring true at all?
It does ring true for me. And I think that growing up in the time that I did, sort of in the shadow of American individualism, and now hearing a lot more about communalism and communism was quite a bit more popular when I was a kid, and is kind of coming back again now. But you hear about the yin yang of the dominant cultures in our world currently, individualism versus communalism, and how some of both can be demonized, and both have positive aspects as well. So it is about balance. And I do find that people who are more deeply considering what does it mean to be an individual within a community, to be fulfilled within that community, even though there's always going to be conflict. Those are the kinds of stories that I'm the most interested in. That's
really, really interesting. Especially, sorry, you said conflict, and now my brain is spinning. I'm kind of like, oh, wow, I want to know more about that. So do you tend to get a certain kind of story or plot? Like, does there tend to be a certain kind of conflict that kind of drives the narratives of manuscripts that you get? Or is there, I guess, a type?
Yeah, there is. And now when you ask that question, do you mean like, what do I see in acquisitions, or do you mean what do I actually acquire?
Let's first address the what do you see in acquisitions, and then we'll get to what do you actually acquire.
It has actually changed over the years. So Stelliform we've had a few open call submission periods since 2020. And during the first open submission call, we got a lot of dystopia, and a lot of works that I would say were kind of, if not directly influenced by The Handmaid's Tale, then very, very focused on reproductive rights and dystopias around reproductive rights, and and very tangentially related to environment. I was surprised at how many of those kinds of stories we got, because obviously any kind of oppression is related to environmental issues if you consider that wide definition of ecology.
Right.
But I don't know if I, as a writer, would write a novel about a kind of oppressive dystopian society where women have no bodily autonomy and say, oh, I should submit this to the environmental publisher. Unless there was some very, very tight connection explored.
Right.
Which I didn't necessarily find. So that was one kind of story that we saw a lot.
Okay.
And then, of course, like the sort of natural near future disaster story, which I don't have anything against necessarily. I just don't acquire a lot because Stelliform is more focused on more character centered than plot centered. So disaster stories are often very plot focused and more concerned with what's happening and why is it happening and how is it connected to whatever's happening over here, which is, can be a fun story and can teach a lot as well. But I often find that those kinds of stories are a little thin in terms of characterization. So
Fair.
If there was a disaster story that was slowed down a little bit and focusing on the people in that situation, how whatever disaster is happening is affecting them on an emotional level, on a level of considerations within their communities, that kind of thing, that would be more what I'm looking for. And of course, I did acquire a few of those, and the first one being Sim Kern's Depart, which is a disaster story. It's a hurricane disaster story, but it is also very focused on identity and the history of one character within a community, and how identity has been an issue for that community for decades or possibly even hundreds of years. It's hard for me to say I would definitely pick up this kind of book or that kind of book, because I have some flexibility in terms of what kind of thing we might acquire, as long as it's character focused.
Okay. All right. So yeah, less about the event and more about the people who are experiencing that event and how they're experiencing it. Is that correct?
Yeah, because I'm always interested in that emotional ecology. I want to know how people's feelings and their connections to each other are affected by their immediate environments and changes in their environment.
Yeah, which is a really important aspect, I think, that a lot of, disaster narratives don't really, or historically have not paid a lot of attention to. So if I wanted to pitch a manuscript to Stelliform Press, what are you looking for in particular? What are the things that would make you go, aha, this is a great story?
Well, it has to be a story, so it needs to have a beginning, middle, and end. And being Canadian, I'm a little bit more open-ended oriented, so I don't need my ending to be neatly tied up in a bow. It can be a little bit vague or open-ended for readers to insert their own interpretations. It has to be character-focused, as I mentioned. Often stories that are rooted in specific communities and identities are important. And even if the story is far future, I would still want to know where that future community came from. What are their histories that they're bringing to the present? Yeah, in terms of characterization, I want deep introspection, at least a little bit, from the characters. Occasionally, the characters need to pause to breathe and, figure out where they are as individuals and as people in relationships with the people and the environment around them. So in terms of what I usually acquire, I do tend toward more literary style writing rather than sort of fast-paced genre writing. Although I do like a blend of that if you can make it work, right? Sometimes the pacing with those things can feel a little bit off when you're trying to do both literary and genre at the same time. I do enjoy an experiment as well. So authors who are trying something and maybe it didn't work entirely, I would love to I would work with that person to make whatever structural experiment or whatever kind of experimentation they're trying to pull off. If it didn't entirely work, I would be happy to bring that book on board and work on that with an author.
Ooh, that's good to know. And sounds like a lot of work. Now, are you the only person in acquisitions and the only editor, or are there more people on your team? There must be a lot of submissions to go through. What does that look like?
I guess because we have a very specific focus. During our open acquisition periods, we haven't been completely overwhelmed. We've gotten anywhere between, say, 100 and 200 submissions per open period. And that's, far less than someone like, Neil Clark at Clark's World is getting. We're not getting 600 submissions a day or whatever it is they get over there. I think the tight focus of the press does deter some people. The submissions themselves are pretty manageable. When we do open for submissions, I have had some volunteers to help me with the reading. Last year, I had an intern who also helped me from the reading from a shared and publishing program. I can't remember the exact name of the program, but hopefully I can get another intern from that program again because she was great. Yeah, so I do have some help, but mostly it is me. And occasionally I do have some freelancers working with me as well. I have a wonderful assistant editor, Ren Hutchings, who has done so much work for me and mostly volunteer, although I'm hoping to be able to pay her more in the future.
Yeah.
She would be one of the people that I would bring on as a freelancer if I got funding for that kind of thing, which I have gotten in the past and did put it towards paying some freelancers. But, funding for Stelliform is not a stable, constant thing. And it's hard for me as well to manage the day-to-day running of the press and also apply for grants because it's so time consuming.
Right.
So that's definitely something that I hope I can manage better in the future. Did I answer the question?
Yeah, that does. That answers the question. I wanted to pivot a little bit actually, because you mentioned that Stelliform Press publishes horror as well. And so I wanted to ask you, as someone who does not read horror or watch it, what is the deal with horror? So you mentioned before that you see it sort of as the flip side of Solarpunk, and I wondered if you could elaborate a bit more on that.
Yeah. Can you tell me why don't you read horror or watch horror?
I do tend to react to things very viscerally, and I am a very anxious person. I find it does very bad things to my imagination. So I recognize that some people really enjoy it, and I recognize it as an art form that is enjoyable, just not by me. So
right.
It's not like I'm like, oh, horror is so terrible, but I know that horror is a genre in and of itself and has some really good examples within the genre, but I'm just not the person. I'm not the intended audience.
Yeah, and of course, reading is subjective. So some of us are much more imaginative visually, and some of the stuff that comes up in horror can definitely stay with you, and you might not want that in your brain.
Yeah, I just can't deal with it.
I am a horror fan. I'm not a very visual reader, so that might be why I can tolerate it a little bit more. I also do occasionally enjoy being emotionally devastated by the things that I'm reading. I think because it feels validating for the moment that we're in. And that's the thing that I think is important about horror, and specifically ecological horror, is that it is validating of an experience that our society and the wider world is often denying entirely, right? Mm-hmm. We have so many leaders in our world who are denying the seriousness of the problem, and quite frankly, not to be depressing about it, but the probable outcome if we don't do anything is pretty horrific. And for those of us who have read a lot of ecological fiction, who have read a lot of climate science papers, it's very scary. And I find that ecological horror lets you dwell in those feelings in a way that often society does not allow you to do.
Oh, interesting. So it's cathartic. It lets you feel your feelings.
Exactly. And, that is something that people often say about horror. And I think it's important specifically for environmental issues to get that treatment occasionally. So I've said this a couple times in other venues, but I feel like horror allows you to feel your feelings without any of the gaslighting that happens in wider society. So,
interesting.
those of us who are knowledgeable about this kind of thing, we often will hear people say, oh, well, you don't need to worry about that. Everything will be fine. It's not actually going to happen. Humans have always been able to manage crises, just denying the fact that we're in a very serious emergency situation right now. And horror really does let you dwell in those feelings and doesn't gaslight you for having them. So I think it's valuable in that way. So someone on Blue Sky said something really funny, and I wanted to make it into a t-shirt. So they said, if you can't handle me at my eco horror, you don't deserve me at my solarpunk.
That's oh wow, yeah.
Turning that Marilyn Monroe thing. Did she actually say that? I'm not actually sure. But
no.
Yeah. Turning that into a quippy little thing about, the possible connection between eco horror and solarpunk. And just to elaborate on why I see those two things as so connected, I think probably because they're both deeply concerned with change. Right. And they approach change in different ways, but they are both welcoming of change in a way that, society has a very hard time with change. We're very slow to go about change. There's a large contingent of our society that would prefer not to change at all, but maybe to even go back to previous societies that would obviously, or, social constructs that wouldn't necessarily work these days. Or, we just don't want to go back there because it was deeply oppressive and unfair for vast swaths of the population. So that is the thing, the connecting tissue for me between eco horror and solarpunk is the welcoming of change and transformation. And of course, we're doing those things in different ways in those genres. Sometimes the change or transformation in horror is horrific. But I think that is a perspective on change that solarpunk could probably acknowledge a little bit more.
Oh, yeah.
And that relates to, my feelings about solarpunk and conflict and how conflict is so important for those stories where, if we don't acknowledge the conflicts that would always arise when society is going through deep and transformative changes, if we don't acknowledge the discomfort, the pain that goes along with that, the way that different parts of society will not agree on the way forward, and we have to find a way forward regardless. Those kinds of things are not comfortable. They are painful. They can be horrific. And so I would love to see solarpunk contend with that a little bit more. Give me a solarpunk eco-horror hybrid novel or novella, and I would just eat it up.
That would be very cool. That is an eco-horror that I would read. And maybe I should read a little bit more eco-horror because it does sound very interesting from a sort of affective point of view of thinking about emotions. Because one of the things that I've been noticing in solarpunk is that, we do tend to focus on the good outcome and utopia and sort of like relentlessly believing in that there can be a good outcome for things, that people can choose to be better, can rise above sort of thing. And I think that part of the reason why solarpunk is so aggressive about that is because we've just had years and years and years of dystopia sort of in our media ecology, basically just being force-fed to us. And we're like, oh my goodness. So what if people weren't terrible to each other all the time? But I also think that solarpunk maybe is going a little bit too far in the other direction, and eco-horror sounds like it's a good way to kind of balance that or sort of intervene into it. I'm not quite sure how that would sort of interact, but it does sound kind of like, Solarpunk's supposed to be about, being optimistic despite knowing all of the facts and knowing that things are going to be bad and still choosing to be optimistic. But I think that knowledge of how bad things are going to get, perhaps it's, I don't know, worth exploring in fiction. Because again, fiction is a great place to sort of do societal experiments without having to breach ethics or, make the world a worse place.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that, there's definitely a place for storylines that are more optimistic, maybe even cozy. But for me personally, and for Stelliform, I do like stories that are nuanced and acknowledge the difficulty of transformation. And also don't shy away from the history of the community that is making up that storyline. So where did those people come from? What were their issues? How did they overcome them? I think those kinds of details can be really helpful for helping readers to see how to get from point A, where we are right now, to a more utopian point B or C or D, or however many steps it takes to get there.
Yeah.
Acknowledging that the Solarpunk community is not a perfect community, and there are different ways to work on the relationship and the relationship building that is so necessary to keep a community together. And there will always be there will always be issues that arise. And I think Serena Ulibarri's Another Life does a really good job at contending with the history of the Atravita community that she has focused on in that book, because it brings in that element, that speculative element of the reincarnation, the proof of reincarnation. I don't know if you've read it, but
I have read it. I don't want to be too mysterious for our audience, but so can you maybe give us just a very short summation?
Sure. So Another Life is focusing on the main character, who is the mediator of Atravita, which is a solarpunk or eco community in Death Valley. And at the very beginning of the book, a scientist working in that community finds scientific proof for reincarnation. And the main character, the mediator, who the community trusts with nearly all of their conflicts, whether it be personal or, wider social issues, a very respected person, a thoughtful person, discovers that she, in a past life, was someone who was pretty vile and who was one of the key figures in an environmental disaster that was so damaging to the world that it became taboo. People wouldn't talk about him, as she finds out that she has a connection to this person. She was this person in another life. So a lot of the novella is this character contending with her past, trying to figure out what is the connection between her and this awful person. And of course, hiding that secret from the community, and ultimately figuring out how to go forward with that truth. And I thought that the reincarnation metaphor was such a great way to bring in this idea of how necessary it is to contend with history. We cannot form utopian communities without contending with history. If we did, vast numbers of people would be denying parts of themselves, whether that be positive or negative. And utopia needs to account for the fullness of humanity, and that is not always positive.
Right. Yeah. I think it's important to I guess, reckon with, those horrific parts of history, those horrific parts of yourself, of maybe your own personal history. You were a terrible person, or you did something terrible. but that doesn't make you now a terrible, I think I don't want to get into, a discussion of cancel culture and all that kind of stuff, because I think that could just sort of veer into a different territory. But very briefly, I just think that Solarpunk needs to have a more fulsome idea of people, so that we acknowledge the good and the bad and recognize that people are capable of overcoming their bad instincts or their instincts for doing bad things and be able to be good. So, just because they were a jerk 10 years ago doesn't mean that now we just don't talk to them. If they were such a bad person that it's actually that they did something very criminal, I'm a big believer in restorative justice. You recognize that is part of the whole person, and you can't move past that, and you can't just, I don't think it's appropriate to just throw somebody in a room and never think about them again, just because if we tend to do that with our own history, then we never reckon fully with how that history can resurface or reemerge in our future and within ourselves. That's part of something I've been thinking about, so I don't really have an end to that thought. It's not super neat. But
yeah, I don't think that there is an end to that thought. It just is a process of acknowledging and contending with that, and building that into the responses of a community. And we're at such an interesting time, and I mean interesting probably in the more negative sense.
Oh, really?
Right now, just in terms of the effect of our very surveillance-focused culture and social media. And it's very hard. I guess what I'm trying to say is it's very hard to get away entirely from your mistakes when so many people, I think, in Western culture in particular, would rather just ignore mistakes and rather than, consider them as part of a learning process. We like in the West, we like our black and white thinking. And
this is true.
So we tend to think of people as good or bad, whereas of course we know that is a binary way of thinking.
It's just easier to be like, you did a bad thing once and now you're in the bad category in my brain and I never have to think about it again, it's...
Right, and the internet won't let us forget the bad things that we've done, especially the younger generations, and I think that they're starting to realize, what kind of effect that has on people.
Yeah.
We do need to be able to make mistakes and apologize for them, move on, grow.
Yeah.
That is just part of human reality.
Yeah, people need room to be able to grow and learn and get past, things that they've done. Like when you were 20, you're a very different person than when you're, 35, right? And your entire worldview might have changed. But if you're held constantly to the standard of being 20, then that can be very difficult to move past, I could imagine.
Exactly. That's the kind of thing that I think more utopian literature would benefit from acknowledging more explicitly the effect of surveillance culture and, how that conflicts with the reality of the human condition. We are changing all the time. We are growing all the time. And we're not going to stay as a static picture of ourselves when we were 20.
Yeah, and thank goodness.
Yeah, exactly.
So what to you are the hallmarks of sort of solarpunk, I guess, as a genre? What would you say is sort of the hallmarks of a solarpunk story? You read it and you're like, yes, that is solarpunk. And then what would you say is absolutely not solarpunk? Like you read something and you're like, this is not it. I'm curious to know sort of what your thoughts are on that.
Well, I think there's a few things that really shout solarpunk for me. One of them is a kind of, definitely an overall optimism. Mm-hmm. And along with that, I think a kind of scrappiness or do-it-yourself kind of attitude amongst the characters. So the characters are taking refuse from a previous world or from a literal garbage dump and making something amazing from it. I love to see that kind of stuff. I kind of grew up reading biopunk science fiction where like scientists were making new things, hybrid things out of like literal flesh and genetics. And I love to see that continuing on, amalgamated with environmental technology, sustainable technology. Yeah, I love that kind of stuff. So yeah, optimism, sort of scrappy do-it-yourself attitude, and usually like some kind of isolationism. And that can be positive or negative, because usually, at least in the reading that I've done, the solarpunk communities are not necessarily the whole world. It's like sort of an anarchist enclave within a larger society, makes this little solarpunk utopia. And then I think that's a good, literary structure, because it helps the reader to become acclimatized to the differences between the solarpunk community versus the outside world that they would be more familiar with those structures. Yeah, I'm sure there's something else, more little attributes that solarpunk has, but those are the three that come to mind. As far as what isn't solarpunk, I just don't think that things that are like 100% technology focused are necessarily solarpunk.
Right.
It does, for me, need to include aspects of changes and adaptations within social and political structures as well. So you can't just slap some solar panels on it. You have to actually change society.
The solarpunk revolution is not just a revolution in terms of, the things that we have, but also the ways in which we live. Yeah, no, I would agree with that. It's a pet peeve of mine that a lot of, future-looking science fiction that purports to make a better society, it's just kind of the same society as we have now. It's just that the problems, or whatever the author thinks are the big problems of the day, are just solved. And things just carry on the way they are. There hasn't been, very much in terms of gender, like parity or acknowledgement, or really any sort of overturn of social structures or economics or politics, or, all of that, which is maybe a lot to ask for, short stories, but definitely in novels, I would hope to see something that's more lies.
I don't know if I've mentioned to listeners that, Stelliform, we mostly deal in long form fiction. So when I'm talking about solarpunk having all these attributes or dealing in depth with specific social structures, Stelliform books have room to do that. Even the novellas are pretty tightly packed with detail and explorations of the nuance of characters within their communities and exploring their identities, etc. So short stories would probably necessarily focus on maybe one or two of those attributes. So we have a lot more room in Stelliform books to do that kind of exploration that I really like to read.
Yeah, and room to sort of develop those characters beyond some sort of starting event or something like that. And it's not all about the set dressing; it's more about the actors.
Exactly.
To say it like that. Yeah. Okay. Where could our listeners go to find out more about Stelliform Press and more about you?
Well, we have a website. The website is www.stelliform.press. Pretty easy to remember. We're also on most social media. I think the only one we're not on, apart from the really fringe ones, is TikTok. We're not on TikTok. I'm not doing videos. I do text. So you can find us on Facebook, Instagram, Blue Sky, the thing that was Twitter, and did I say Mastodon already? And Threads. So
okay.
I post to those fairly regularly about what's going on with Stelliform, and I far less regularly send out newsletters. So if you're a newsletter person, you can sign up for the Stelliform newsletter on our contact page. I send out maybe 2 or 3 newsletters a year, so very sporadic.
Okay, so it's not like if you sign up, you're going to, doom your inbox to a whole bunch.
No, not at all. And occasionally I send out interesting previews. I've done a couple of cover reveals through the newsletter, and sometimes there's discount codes. So it is worth it to sign up for the newsletter.
That's so cool. Well, thank you so much for taking time out of your extremely busy schedule to talk to me and to come on the podcast and talk a little bit about Stelliform Press. I feel like I need to go read some eco-horror now.
I could make some suggestions.
Yeah, I mean, please do.
I mean, obviously, suggesting Stelliform titles. One of our top eco-horror titles is Tiffany Morris's Green Fuse Burning. If you have an artist's soul and you are, maybe contending with some grief in your life, it is an excellent, excellent exploration of those issues, along with, how those issues connect to the environment. Mm-hmm. And it's just a trip. It is a trippy book. It's not too gross. There's a few little gross things in it.
Okay.
Very fun. Right. Yeah.
I'm warned.
If you like books that are like weirder horror, not gross at all, but like very creepy and unsettling, Dennis Monbauer's The House of Drought was a World Fantasy finalist last year. It's a very excellent book and an interesting structural experiment.
Yeah.
Set in Sri Lanka, so like very interesting in terms of setting and character, and just like immerses you into a very strange world.
That sounds fascinating and also potentially terrifying. So I'm excited to check it out. Thank you again so much for talking to me.
Thank you for some wonderful questions. It's been great to talk about Solarpunk and to try to hash out some of the ways that, Solarpunk is doing amazing things, but maybe it could also do a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing about Utopia is that it always pushes you to do more and to
exactly.
Do, right? So we're always progressing towards something better. All right. Thank you so much. And that's it for this week.
Thank you, Ariel.
And that's it for this episode of Solarpunk Presents Podcast. Thanks for sticking through until the end. We hope you really enjoyed this conversation and are excited to read the eco-fiction and maybe even the eco-horror of Stelliform Press. Until next time, have fun and stay Solarpunk.
Thank you for listening to Solarpunk Presents, a podcast hosted and produced by Ariel, Kroon, and Christina de la Rocha.
The audio for this episode was recorded in part on the traditional territory of the neutral Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe peoples.
And in Germany. The opening and closing music for this podcast is Water Cooler Gang by Monkey Warhol, available for use under the Creative Commons Attribution 4.0 International License.
Don't forget to support us on Patreon at patreon.com/solarpunkpresents.
Every little bit helps us keep bringing you discussions and interviews.
Until the next episode, keep dreaming.
And stay Solarpunk.